Welcome, everyone. We are so delighted to have you. Welcome to the first Mellon Sawyer event 2021. Tonight's event is led by our Mellon Sawyer Fellows. It's a roundtable titled Incite Without Insight. I would like to introduce all of our panelists, and I will introduce them in the order they are in your flyer. So Professor Wolfram is William C. Friday Distinguished University Professor at North Carolina State University, where he also directs the North Carolina Language and Life Project. He has pioneered research on social and ethnic dialects since the 1960s and published numerous books and articles on the subject. In addition to his research interests, Professor Wolfram is particularly interested in the application of sociolinguistic information to the public, including the production of 13 television documentaries, the construction of museum exhibits, and the development of innovative formal and informal materials related to language diversity. He has received numerous awards and was inducted into the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We also have with us Professor Gareth Price, who is a sociolinguist and political sociologist who teaches in the linguistics program at Duke. He's also affiliated with the Asian Pacific Studies Institute. His research focuses on the relationships between language and politics, and his recent monograph on language, society, and the state in Taiwan was published by De Gruyter in 2019. Dr. Price has written or been interviewed in various media outlets on language, society, and politics, including The Guardian, Huffington Post, Seattle Times, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Welcome, Gareth.
Thank you.
Professor Michael Newcity is visiting professor of Slavic Studies and Linguistics and deputy director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies at Duke University. He practiced law in New York City and Singapore, and prior to coming to Duke, taught law in Sydney, Australia, and Tacoma, Washington. Professor Newcity is the author of numerous books, book chapters, and articles on the Soviet and Russian legal systems. He has also testified as an expert witness on Russian law in several cases in federal and state courts in the United States, as well as in the courts of Australia, Brazil, Chile, Japan, and the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Welcome.
Hi there.
Professor Edna Andrews is the Nancy and Jeffrey Marcus Distinguished Professor at Duke University. She is a professor of linguistics and cultural anthropology, chair of the linguistics program, and a member of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences. She also directs the Duke Focus program. Professor Andrews is the author of numerous books, articles, and studies in cognitive neuroscience, linguistics, and semiotics. Her current research includes an extensive longitudinal fMRI study of second language acquisition, lifelong musicianship, and multilingualism, and new approaches to embodied cognition and language and music. Welcome. Thank you for everybody, for all of our guests and for everybody who is here. We will be presenting, you'll be hearing presentations in the opposite order, actually. We do have a Q&A, but it will be happening at the end of the presentation. Feel free to post your questions to the host in the chat, and we'll be sure to get to them. Thank you.
So as one of the organizers of the Mellon Sawyer Seminar Series, I want to welcome all of you to this engagement, and we're looking forward to some lively questions at the end. As you know, we've had some tumultuous events in the last few weeks that surprised and awed many of us. Today we wanted to bring a panel of experts in linguistics to talk about what it means, potentially. So insight without insight is my contribution initially. You know, how did we get here? And so Abby's going to put up the slides. So my idea is to talk about the importance of linguistic theory and understanding language use. There are two databases that we used, or I used, and a shout out to Norma Mendoza Denton, but factba.se and then rev.com. So right now I'd like to show you 5 points for discussion. I do want to mention that I tried to do in all of my linguistic research, whether it's using corpora or it's ethnographic or it's identity-based or it's theory or mathematical linguistics or sociolinguistics, is ecologically valid language use and discourse, oral and written. So I'm going to give you 5 points. They're both 5. These 5 points would be 5 long lectures. So it'd be 5 hours. It's going to be 5 minutes. So number 1, I thought the interesting thing to start with would be sign zero. For those of you in linguistics, you know, this is a long, well-respected theoretical concept from the 20th century, from international linguistics, when nothing means something. And so the first thing that came to mind when I was thinking of the discourse around the events that led to January 6th are the remarkable things that are missing, speech events that never happened. 1, there was no concession after the election in November. 2, there was no phone call to the vice president when he was under siege in the Capitol from the president, which is surprising. And finally, the minimalization of the mention of the COVID pandemic in the discourse from the last year. And in fact, the word COVID itself is not used. What is used is an offensive term, the China virus. And I would note that usages of COVID are in a 2-word phrase, relatively rarely used, COVID relief. So that's the first, is what's missing. And that really frames, I think, everything else that we will talk about. The second category I wanted to look at is what many sociolinguistics specialists have brought to the table. They call the dog whistle in talking about the discourse of this last administration. What I would suggest is that they're saying that there's a secret code going on between the White House and certain members of the base. And you know, this is a very long discussion, and I'm going to give you a very short one-liner, basically, that I think we have to come to this by looking specifically at speech communities and communities of practice. And you see the definitions on your screen. We have an interesting situation here. First of all, it's not really a dog whistle. It's just directed to communities of practice that are very targeted and that do not include many of the pundits and other analysts of the discourse. So it does seem like a dog whistle. And secondly, there's something very interesting going on. Usually speech communities, you identify within your speech communities. And here we have this interesting disjunction that the former administration and their base actually are from very different speech communities, and they have very little in common linguistically. So this is, and I think of, and this reminds, something that Professor Wolfram might mention later, Bill LeBeouf's work in New York and Peter Trudgill in Norwich. We know that people aren't very good at characterizing how they speak, and that they often idealize certain speech communities. And I wonder if that's not coming to play here. So that's my second point. Third point is language is dialogic. And we see this happening in such a rich set of contexts. And I believe, is this where we have some sound bites? So please enjoy. I can't hear Nikki.
Here.
What, you guys were supposed to.
Could you not hear it?
No, there's no sound.
Okay, when I did it earlier, you could hear it. 1 second.
Okay, so let's stop for a second. The idea I had was I wanted to show you what the source was that led to the chanting. So what you have basically is hundreds and hundreds of references in the oral and written materials saying that the election was stolen and rigged. This has been going on since 2015, before the first election. And so this narrative of the election would be stolen and rigged went on and on and on and on. And then you see this sort of dialogic emerging in the response, which is very ritualistic and chant based, and there's an aesthetic to it, although a frightening one, which is what was supposed to be in this film clip, which was the chant, "Stop the Steal." Can you try again, guys?
This is Hang Mike Pence.
Okay, this was a Hang Mike Pence. Okay, that's another. So there were two I was going to mention.
That was nice. I'm glad I invited her up. Kelly, I'm glad I invited you up. That was great. Thank you, darling.
So, thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
This was, I was trying to make the point that there are many examples where there are hundreds and hundreds of speech events, whether oral or in tweets or in other texts, that state a claim, and then at a time later you see the response, which becomes something more crowd-based, chant-like ritual, like the elections was stolen, the election was rigged, and then stop the steal, sort of like a football game. Okay, that's an interesting, I think there's a lot of territory there that could be explored moving forward. The fourth category is, I just wanted to mention that there are very interesting interactions between oral and written speech acts produced in these contexts that are quite challenging, and this hooks up with number 3. And the last one that I'm going to mention, because my time is up, is number 5, is what about the hoax? So in February 28th, 2020, there was an interview, there was a tweet that said that there's a new hoax, and I think they're showing it to you now.
That's the wrong tweet.
That's the wrong tweet, sorry. There was a tweet that said that the Democrats had come up with a new hoax, and it was about COVID. And in the first, in January, starting on the 27th of January, any pronouncements about the virus included the word virus and talked about working with China. But very soon, in March 18th, I think is the first time we hear it, we suddenly now go to a new linguistic form, China virus. And then even on the 26th of March, there was a version Chinese virus, but mainly China virus. And there are literally, I had in the database that I consulted, there were 509 examples of the China virus. But there are, as I said, there are very, very few examples of the word COVID at all, and it's only with the word COVID release. So Birx recently, as my porting shot, Birx said that it was, that there were COVID deniers in the White House, and they believed that it was in fact a hoax. And there's a lot to go on with Birx's information in her last interviews. So I just want to set up, this is a very complex linguistic situation, and these are the 5 points that I wanted to bring to your attention to get the ball rolling. Thank you so much.
Abby, do you want to go ahead and show my PowerPoint?
Yes, I will.
As Edna says, this is a very complicated situation linguistically, and as complicated as that may be, it is also extremely complicated legally. If the operative question is what happened on January 6th, I know that for me, the thing that happened on January 6th was I realized I had to devote a lot more attention to the topic of incitement in my course on law and language. I think it's probably true that more attention has been paid to the concept, the legal concept of incitement since January 6th than it has been paid to it in the preceding century. From a legal and constitutional point of view, there are two similar issues to be addressed. One of them, of course, is the impeachment of Donald Trump. Impeachment is very much a free-form exercise under the US Constitution, and the concept of a high crime and misdemeanor does not need to equate to a crime as defined either by federal or local law. And so when you look at, if you want to go to the next slide, when you look at the impeachment resolution that was adopted by the House of Representatives, the discussion of what constitutes incitement is fairly sparse. It's assumed to be implicit in the actions, and certainly some of them are quoted, but because impeachment is a political remedy, there is no necessity for the high crime and misdemeanor to be defined with precision. The second area of the law in which incitement relates are federal or local criminal charges. And it's certainly conceivable that in the coming months, Donald Trump and others who spoke at the rally on January 6th may be charged either under DC law, which has comparable provisions, or under federal law, which prohibits incitement to a riot. There also is a federal criminal law which prohibits incitement to insurrection. And then finally, and I haven't included this on my slide, there is another federal charge called seditious conspiracy, which in fact may be a more applicable charge. One of the things that's quite interesting about the federal laws relating to incitement is that while, for instance, the federal criminal code defines what a riot is, it never attempts to define what constitutes incitement. Now, the courts have certainly attempted to do that. If you want to go to the next slide. There's a common sense notion of incitement. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as encouraging or stirring up violent or unlawful behavior. And go to the next slide. And one of the things, I mean, the biggest issue with respect to federal or state criminal law is where the boundary between incitement and First Amendment protected speech is. It's clear as a matter of constitutional doctrine that incitement is not protected by the First Amendment. But certainly the court cases that have interpreted and applied these principles have defined incitement that can be criminally punished as in a very narrow sense. Next slide, please. The leading case on this, the one that has been quoted often in connection with the impeachment, is the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, which related to a meeting of the Ku Klux Klan in the state of Ohio in the late 1960s, in which the leader of the Klan made a statement that if Congress, the Supreme Court, and the president continue to suppress the white Caucasian race, it's possible that there might have to be some revengeance taken. And, you know, that is the word he used. That is not a typographical error. Clarence Brandenburg was prosecuted under a state statute in Ohio for saying that. And the case ultimately made its way up to the US Supreme Court, where the court concluded, and again, the next slide, that what Brandenburg had said was protected by the First Amendment. And what the Supreme Court has said is not protected by the First Amendment, must meet 3 tests. The speech must encourage the use of violence or lawless action. The speaker must intend that his speech will result in the use of violence or lawless action. And the imminent use of violence or lawless action is the likely result of his speech. And I think it's important to consider particularly the second criterion there, because one of the things that's characteristic of Donald Trump in these sort of situations is, while he certainly engages in fiery rhetoric and winds up his audience, he also indulges in euphemisms as well. And so the real question, I think, would be whether or not Donald Trump intended that his speech on January 6th would result in the use of violence or lawless action. And certainly there's been a lot of discussion of the number of times in which he called on the crowd to fight, and there will be an extensive discussion, if this ever goes to a court, as to whether or not that was rhetorical or was actually intended to invite violence. But whether or not what Donald Trump did on January 6th actually constitutes incitement, or whether or not it is protected under the First Amendment, is something that you know, is not a clear-cut decision, it seems to me. If you want to go to the next slide. There, in fact, was a precedent for this involving Donald Trump that arose out of the 2016 campaign. During the campaign, Trump conducted a campaign rally in Louisville, Kentucky, in which several demonstrators raised signs and demonstrated during his rally. And he called from the podium to get them out of there. And Abby, if you can play the embedded video in the picture of Trump.
But if our real job rate and if our real unemployment rate was a real 5%, we wouldn't have the tens of thousands of people in this room right now. We wouldn't have them. All right, get him out, get him out, get him out. Get him out. Get him out of here. It's incredible, incredible. What are they doing? Oh, look, we have here some wonderful people. Oh, get out of here, get out, get out, get out of here. Unbelievable. USA, USA, USA.
Okay, Abby, that's enough of that. What ensued within the crowd, and there are video of this as well, is that several members of the audience grabbed the demonstrators and roughed them up and forced them out. And at least one of these individuals was punched, and they ended up suing Donald Trump, the Trump campaign, and the individuals from the audience for incitement to riot. And ultimately, this case went up to the US Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And if you want to go to the next slide, what the court concluded was that under the circumstances, the plaintiffs had not made out a case that incitement to riot had occurred, at least as that phrase is defined under Kentucky law. And they also held that his speech was protected by the First Amendment. Now, what I would say in that context is that I think his speech on January 6th was more explicit, certainly. But the most difficult issue for lawyers to argue and judges to decide would be whether or not Trump intended that his audience on January 6th would resort to violence or lawlessness. And, you know, he does tend to use euphemisms. One of the interesting features of the Nwangumo case in Kentucky was that the individuals who were responsible for roughing up the demonstrators defended themselves in part by saying they wouldn't have done their action if they hadn't been called on to do so by Donald Trump, which is going to be very similar, I have no doubt, to what individuals will do in defending themselves for what happened on January 6th. The problem is, it seems to me, is those sort of defenses are not entirely credible because the individual defendants have a vested interest in laying blame off on, in this case, Donald Trump. And so it didn't work in the Nwangumo case to try and cast liability onto Donald Trump. And I have some measure of doubt whether it will work in the case of the January 6th insurrection. Quite honestly, I think rather than incitement, which consists exclusively of words, I think a conspiracy charge under the federal seditious conspiracy statute, which involves speech and action, would be much more likely to be successful if it were addressed to Trump and his relatives and aides. But, you know, whether or not any prosecutor is willing to put it to the test, time will tell. So I will await any questions you might have.
Questions are at the end.
Right.
Yeah.
And I will await them.
Okay, so moving from that talk of about incitement, I'm going to talk today about the actual speech itself on January the 6th, and I'm not going to address whether or not it directly incites or directly, yes, whether it directly is incitement. But whether or not certain other aspects of the speech provide context for incitement and context for the events that happened. So if we'd like to move to the first slide, please. the basic argument here is that Trump is talking about fake news and big tech. Now that's it's not a new fake news. Of course, is nothing new with Trump, but we can zoom in on that and his particular use of big tech as well, and tech in this speech here. And the argument here is that technology companies that provide social media and news platforms play a really important role in what's called the public sphere, and we'll look at what the public sphere is. It's a concept in political sociology and sociology more generally, but it's an essential forum for deliberative democracy. Now, you've got to keep these companies and media platforms under scrutiny because they act as incredibly important gatekeepers nowadays. But nonetheless, I'm sort of going to demonstrate how Trump's discourse undermines trust and faith in the public sphere by blaming big tech and fake news for the election. And the implication, and it's more of an implication than a conclusion here, is that he sows distrust in media freedoms, the notion of an open society, and the democratic process, and that provides the context for some of the events that happened on January the 6th here. So if we move on to the first, for the next slide, please, you can see here the public sphere. When we look at the public sphere, it's a concept in political sociology. It's made up of private people gathered together as a public and articulating the needs of society with the state. What's happening here is, that's Habermas's quote there, what's happening here is that people are coming together, and the public sphere is a space between the state and civil society, where people in civil society can deliberate about what the state should be doing, and also the common good, the good life for civil society, for society more broadly here. So it's a forum. It's an incredibly important forum for deliberative democracy here. It has the potential to counter the excesses of the state, or at least it did in its classical model. But people coming together, people discussing, people debating, and the notion of a free media is more generally is important here, because where we used to sort of have these face-to-face meetings in the public square and that sort of thing, increasingly technology and it was broadcast media, and now increasingly social media is mediatizing the public sphere. If you'd like to move on to the next slide, please. Now, there are legitimate criticisms of the public sphere in practice. It actually works in practice rather than it's an ideal form. In its ideal form, it's accessible to everyone. Historically, Nancy Fraser, being kind of one example here, has pointed out, and others as well, Nancy Fraser being perhaps the most famous critique of Habermas, it actually is a historically restricted access to various people, to women, working class and poor, BIPOC people, and Jacqueline Erler points out that also if you don't speak the dominant language of civil society, then actually you tend to be excluded from the dominant public sphere. Social media has ameliorated some of these restrictions to access by being accessible to more people, and a media model that is definitely many-to-many broadcasting, and that sort of thing. But we don't know how much, and there's some data to say that people are actually turned off from operating the public sphere through social media. Algorithms are increasingly gatekeepers rather than humans, and the state, when it's never entirely free from the influence of the state. The public sphere is also always influenced to some degree by the state. So they're legitimate criticisms of the public sphere in practice. But if we move to go to the next one, there's some strong benefits of the public sphere here. They do play a role in free, open, and democratic societies. Without some sort of free public sphere, and with relatively accessible here, without some sort, it's difficult to think about how democracy can operate. Again, there there are legitimate criticisms of that, but what I'm trying to get at here is that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, and just because it's not perfect in practice doesn't mean we don't want to approach it as an ideal form here. And if political leaders undermine trust in the public sphere, they undermine trust in media freedom, they undermine trust in an open society, and also in the democratic process as well. So that's sort of kind of the public sphere in a nutshell here. So if we move on to the next slide here, looking at Trump's speech, it's about 11,000 words long. Which is a lot to go through with a fine-tooth comb. It's a lot to digest on pen and paper here. So we can use some software methodologies here to dig through the speech itself here, and that's what I've done with the speech here, about 11,000 words here. And the important thing here is that we can't just look at words in isolation here. We need to understand them and we can mine out the words in the speech, but we can through software. But we need to see them in context as well. And one way to do this is to use concordance and concordance software, which will give us concordances that looks at the immediate context in which a given word is found. And also collocation analysis, which will look at how words co-occur together. And it'll also give us a rank, the frequency of the words, and also a rank based on statistical analysis as well. And I won't go into the statistical analysis because it's a bit of that's a longer discussion here. But what it helps us do is to zoom in and out of a text and to figure out what we're looking for. And so we can zoom in and focus on individual words. We can zoom out and we can look at these words in context. And it gives us points in the text and points in this case in the speech to dive into the speech and see what's going on here. And so I've got some data here. The concordance software will come up with words that are close by or co-occurring with the search terms. And what I've done is I've stripped them out, and I've stripped out everything but the adjectives and verbs. Okay, and I've also stripped out be, have, and do to look at what is being how things are being described and what is being done or alleged to have been to have been done by in this speech here. And so if we move on here, this is the concordance of tech. Now, it only appears 7 times in 11,000 words. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but actually these can be very important and signifiers for key themes and discourses. So even if it only occurs a handful of times in the broader scheme of things, there's a lot going on here. And you can see here, big tech, big tech, big tech, big tech, all these tech monopolies, big tech. If we move on to the next one here, to zoom out a little bit here and to look at that's the concordance I've just shown you. Here are collocations. They are if you go to the next slide here, we've got the frequency, shows us how many that occur here, how many occurrences in the text. We've got the next one, we've got the rank. Okay, so that's 1 to 63, but obviously I've stripped out words that are not adjectives or verbs, so that's why it doesn't go from what it's not sequential. But that's the rank, that's the statistics, the magic statistics bit. And then if you have a look here, we've got these syntactic categories, which is the adjectives or verbs, and also we've got 8. The next slide shows us that they are appearing 8 left and 8 right of the search term here. So if we have a look at the next one here, we've got these big and biggest, superlative biggest derived from root big. That's not necessarily that interesting because actually it doesn't turn out that he's using it in the same way. So we've got to be a little bit careful of drawing conclusions there. But the next one is interesting. The next one is this notion of fake and accountable, which are the second and third adjectives here, second and fourth adjectives here. And we can see on the next slide here that they're they're in an oppositional semantic relationship. If you are fake, you're not accountable, although you can be held accountable for being fake, I guess here. Possibly near antonyms. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it's worth thinking about. For the next one, we've got the verb beat. I mean, this is mentioned. This comes up quite close by, and he's doesn't talk about lose and lost here. Next slide, please. These I think are really interesting. These demoralize, control, and abuse. The demoralized, control, and abuse. He's talking about these are used in conjunction with tech and big tech in particular, and those give us a clue that there's something interesting happening here. So what we would do then is we then zoom out, because, and on the next slide, beyond what the software is telling us, we need to use our eyes here and look at what's going on here. And lo and behold, we do find that the software isn't picking up even more interesting stuff here. Surprised, took, and rigged, interfere, and deceive are also verbs that appear in close collocation to big tech here. Next one, please. There's news. If we go to the next one. And then if we just zip through those slides here, there's a fake, bad, and corrupt are our adjectives, our main adjectives here. We've got stolen, ruined, and won, that the verb won again. And then we've got direct attacks on the media here. The media is the biggest problem as far as as far as I'm concerned, single biggest problem, the fake news and the big tech, which is what we find in here. And perhaps even more darkly, the next slide here. You know what else? We don't have a free and fair press. Our media is, you can read that. I don't need to read it for you, and I don't need to give those words any more of an airing than they already have been. But you can see here that it leads us, this sort of analysis leads us to interesting data that's in the speech here, and undermining the public sphere. And that's really kind of the wrapping up there. If we just go to the last slide, I think it's the last slide here. As I said, he spends a lot of the time not talking about big tech and media, but nevertheless, they're key signifiers and themes and discourses. There is good reason to give tech companies and media a free pass. We want to be critical of the media, but Trump sets out to undermine the potential of news and social media and big tech more broadly, undermine their potential to act in open, fair ways in the public sphere. And I think this is not done from a sense of democracy or fairness. This is an attempt to control media narratives to his own advantage from the bully pulpit. And this provides the context for the violence against the Capitol, which is the logical conclusion, of casting doubt on the democratic process. I think I'm within my time. Thank you. There's some references for you there.
Am I next?
You're next, our final presenter.
Okay, could you pull up my presentation and we'll start here. My approach is going to be both more general and more specific. And one of the things that the previous slides have demonstrated is we need a full complement of methodology. We need corpus linguistics. We need all we need detailed linguistics. We need background knowledge. And I hope you can go to the second one, that actually we can also bring in, and I'll show you how I do that in the end, a humanistic element. Actually, the whole notion of language in life and sort of relevant to things like this is not something that's new at all. As a matter of fact, Dwight Bollinger's presidential address at the Linguistic Society of America in 1972, and you'll recall that was the era when the Nixonian impeachment trial was looming over the country, and his speech was titled "Truth as a Linguistic Question." I've always found that a fascinating and kind of inspirational article. And as you can see, language should be as much an object of public scrutiny as any of the other things that keenly affect our lives, as much as pollution, energy, crime, busing, and next week's grocery bill. So if you click, we'll get the final. And what I'm saying here, there's a sense in which as the impeachment goes forward and Congress considers what is said, that like forensic linguists have been active in lots of different cases where truth is a question, that they need a linguist. So if you press on the next click, okay, things like threat, insurrection, what are directives, promises, truth, how language works pragmatically, and so forth, are all issues here that really call for people with expertise in these areas, and we would assume that linguists are those people. So let's move to the next slide, where we go to sort of the issue. Okay, so we know, we've learned in introductory linguistics, sort of that there are presuppositions and implicatures in terms of speaking. So if you'll click the next slide. So this is sort of a classic definition of a presupposition. And then if you look at a particular example, click the slide, okay. So for example, if one says, make America great again, it presupposes America was great at its previous time, all right? So all of these are sort of embodied in a simple statement like this. So if you click the next one, and if you take terms like fake news and click the next one, rigged an election, click the next one, stolen election, it presupposes the condition that is being described here. And if you push to the next one, we'll go to the, yeah. So the only way to get out of a presupposition is to explicitly deny it. I did a court case some years ago in which a victim who was accused of rape and murder, he was later exonerated on the basis of DNA when DNA became a legitimate sort of application. But anyhow, he had an IQ, you know, we all know the problems with the IQ test, but in the 60s somewhere, and he was interviewed by the police, all right, who had determined that he was the perpetuator. At one point in the examination of him, they said, what did you do with the shirt after you killed her? All right. As it turns out, given his mental cognitive ability, he was incapable of directly countering that presupposition. And these come into state. Okay, in my own case, okay, I'm going to tell you a little anecdote, and I'm also going to finish with a surprising anecdote on a personal note, because as it turns out, several of my sons have interacted personally with Donald Trump. So I'll tell you that story at the end. I had a mother who would never lie about anything. She was scrupulous about lying, all right? And so if somebody called me on the phone, notably in this case, a young woman, all right, she would call me to the phone. I said, Mom, I don't want to be here, okay? So we made an arrangement, right, in which when that particular person called, I would go to the front door, step outside so that my mother could say he's not here. Okay. So what we see is this sort of manipulation of sort of what is stated figuratively and what is stated by an implication. The fact of the matter is whether I was in the house physically or not was irrelevant. I was accessible. And that was it. So if you push if you click this, sort of, so the question here is, does truth include implicature? Because this becomes a big case in things that Donald Trump has said. So if you can click to the next slide, we'll go over, okay. So conversational implicatures. So what we have, click the next button. I have lots of sort of, we'll do this gradually. So we all know from our introductory courses about conversational implicature, deductions, which are on what is not said in accordance with maximum relevance, quality, manner, and so forth. Okay, so if you click on the next one, so we get something like this. If somebody says, this is a classic example in the introductory literature, I just ran out of gas, and I say there's a gas station around the corner, and the person goes around the corner and finds that there's a gas station that's closed, you know, and then they come back to me, I can simply say, well, there is a gas station around the corner, but of course the relevant fact is the person needs gas. If it's a closed gas station and they can't get gas, then that's a problem. So if you click on the next one there. So in this case, conversational implicatures can readily be denied. And there are lots of people and lots of situations where we all know people who we would consider as sort of lying by implicature, we'll say. Okay, so go to the next slide there. Okay, so click again, and we'll see an example here. So one of the things that Trump said is it's statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. All right, so he tweeted this, big protest on January 6th. Be there, we'll be wild. Okay, so what it presupposes is that there was a statistical analysis of some type, all right, for him to state that it was statistically impossible, right? If somebody says it's statistically impossible, or statistically this is what happens with our data, we all assume that some statistical formula has been applied to the data. But what it does implicationally is it says that this is relevant, and it underscores the validity of the claim. All right, so if you click on the next one, we'll move to that. So let's just look at the adjective real, okay? So at 4 or 5 times, I've actually sort of, I think it was 4 times, he uses the word real, all right? And I was told by the real pollsters, we do have real pollsters. They know that we were going to do well and we were going to win. And you're the real people. You're the people that build this nation. So it presupposes that there's a category of different people. If you're talking about real people, then it presupposes that there are other people as well. And since it states that they're real, it implies the non-authenticity of the other folks, the folks who are doing polls, who are building the nation. So if you'll click again. Okay. Now, one of the things that I was curious about, and actually one of the things that I found really curious about it, because I looked at sort of all of the facts, quotes, so-called, and there were lots of facts in that speech. You know, things were offered by facts. There were particular numbers that were mentioned, you know, and one of the things that was referenced from time. So at one point, it says that that election, our election was over 10 o'clock in the evening. We're leading Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia by hundreds of thousands of votes, okay? So he establishes an arbitrary time for the valid votes, all right? And then he goes forward, and then he says, okay, this act where he's talking about sort of votes coming in after this arbitrary time that he set up, and all of the newscasters, everyone was talking about sort of the sort of time span of what was going to explain, but he set this arbitrary time. So anything after that time was going to be invalid. And so in that sense, he's very specific about what he says in terms of time. So this act coincided with a mysterious vote dump of up to 100,000 votes for Joe Biden, almost none for Trump. Oh, that sounds right. That was at 1:34 a.m. And then at 6:31 a.m. in the early morning hours, after voting had ended, Michigan suddenly reported 147,000 votes. Okay, so there's a sense in which sort of there's an arbitrary time, and clandestine activities occur when folks are asleep. I can remember there was somebody was shot at NC State at one point in the dorm, and it was about 2 o'clock. And I was riding with the chancellor on a visit. She was new, and I was riding on a visit to Robinson County. She asked me to go with and talk to the folks there. And she was just alerted of what had happened. And this will never sort of always be with me. She said, you know, after 12 o'clock at night, nothing good happens. All right. So if you're up after 12 o'clock, nothing good is going to happen. Now, look at how sort of these particular times are framed in people are asleep. Nothing is good is going to happen, which is sort of like almost a sort of one of those givens of our society that everybody sort of believes in a little, but look how it's operative here. Okay, go to the next slide here. Now, here are the kinds of mechanisms that come into play in terms of a lot of the things that Trump has been accused, or anyone. All right, here's what we do in terms of communicating. And I would say, along with George Lakoff, you know, that actually Republicans have seemed to do a much better job of this than Democrats over the years. So one of the things is repetition. The more a word is heard, the more the circuit is activated and the stronger the impact. And of course, he has that book called Don't Think of an Elephant, which is like saying to a group of kids, okay, so the only thing I don't want you to do is put the raisins up your nose, which of course incites 30 kids in your class. Never thought of that. That's an interesting idea, all right? But the point is, what we have is we have synapses being triggered by these sorts of things. Then there's this sort of framing. We purposely setting up the defining context, you know, such as rigged election, American patriots identified with this group, that illegality is immorality, and so forth. And then another thing is to come up with well-known examples that people will remember of shootings, theft, illegal behavior. They create fear, calling for a strict authoritarian father figure like Donald Trump. And this is sort of following from George Lakoff, which has lots of problems, but I think there are also very sort of interesting kinds of points to take. Or grammatical phrasing, you know, such as the China virus, such as radical Islamic terrorists, real people or pollsters. And this is interesting because in his book, From the Art of the Deal, he calls this truthful hyperbole and a very effective form of promotion. Now that's interesting because one of the questions is whether Trump is simply being hyperbolic or whether he is actually telling lies. And then the last thing is sort of the unconscious metaphorical thought that past presumed ideal state of make America great again. You know, those of us who know about the history of America know that it's never been great. You know, it's been great for privileged people, and so there's this unconscious metaphorical thought. Okay, so move to the next one, and then the last thing, those of you, those people who study introductory linguistics sort of may simply are introduced to indirect speech acts, you know, where we use one speech act to communicate another one. So in the text, near the end, he says, and we fight like hell. And we don't fight like, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So what we have here is we have a declaration, we fight, you know, but is the declaration really an indirect speech act to fight? And we also have a conditional. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So click the next one. Okay. So, and then he says to the crowd, so we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to walk to the Capitol and we're going to try and give, and he doesn't finish it. So the question here, and people have talked about his use of we here. Now, most introductory textbooks talk about we, which can be, it can be inclusive or exclusive. But the question is sort of, how is he using it? Now we know sort of in medicine, there can be a kind of empathetic we. So for example, someone might say, well, we're going to take our nasty tasting pill now, right? And so, no, you're not taking it. The patient is taking it. But there's a sense of empathy. Now, we don't know what he intends, but the question is it inclusive or exclusive in that case? It's certainly not, well, maybe it is empathetic. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, okay? So then if you click it one more time, all right, we'll go to the last slide, and I'm going to tell you stories. I'm going to tell you 3 stories. As it turns out, I have 3 sons, all of whom have MBAs and are business people. And in their business interactions, all of them have interacted with Donald Trump. So, and this is where we sort of get a humanistic perspective, okay? So my first son, who happens to be CEO of a venture capital firm, the kinds of firms that many academics hate, if you click this, he dealt, and I should also say that all of these things were said to me long before Donald Trump became president. Okay, so he dealt with them on a couple of deals. And after his dealing with this, he said, he's a buffoon. Everybody knows he's an awful businessman. He's really incompetent as a businessman. Okay, so now we're talking about the person and his image and how the person sort of is attached to the communicative acts. So his assessment was he's an incompetent business person, all right? And by the way, I've never told these stories before, but in thinking about this, I think it would sort of give you perspective. So then there's my second son, okay? So he was working on a project in the Meadowlands where they were trying to clean up the Meadowlands dump. My third son, I'm sorry, this is my third son, but the second encounter, all right? So he went to Donald Trump's studio where he was filming, and he had an interaction with Trump and there was a singer there, a country singer. My son was embarrassed because he was so hyperbolic. My son, who worked for a sort of medium to small size group in Raleigh, was introduced as, this is the most powerful group in the country. And my son sort of, what? What are you saying? And then he introduced the country singer to him. And he said, now this guy is the best and most popular singer in America. My son was embarrassed because it was so hyperbolic that it was out there. But we are dealing with a person who believes in hyperbole. Okay. So the most dramatic encounter was this son number 3. He was working for NASCAR at the time. All right, he was a vice president or some executive at NASCAR, and they had a meeting scheduled with Donald Trump for branding or whatever they were doing. I don't know exactly what it was. And after their encounter, he said, we had this meeting with Trump, all right? And he said, it was really awful. First of all, he came into the meeting. We had never known him before. And he came into the meeting. He came into the meeting complaining that he had almost been caught cheating on his wife. So he thought, like, he doesn't even know us. That is so inappropriate to come into this meeting and talk about that. one of the guys, it was not my son, asked him how he dealt with this dilemma. And this is what he said, if you'll click the last one. I just keep telling the same lie. Oops. I just keep telling the same lie, and eventually people will believe you. All right. Does that sound familiar? Right? So we're dealing with a character who behind these words sort of belies a highly flawed person. And there's a sense in which the total context of what he says has to be considered in terms of who he is as a person, completely outside the political arena. And these are the candid impressions of my son, who all of whom gave them these impressions to me and told me these stories long before he ever became president of the United States. So I thought that I would end on this note. I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but quite frankly, I'm not sure I care. Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes for questions. Abby, Kathy, you have the questions? Abby has the questions. Walt, that was a scream. Thank you.
You didn't know I had indirect impressions.
No, I had no idea.
Interactions with Donald Trump.
Deep connections.
Yeah, everything people say about him is verified.
Feel free to send to me questions and I will ask them for you. So our first one comes from Dr. Lee Baker. He is addressing it to Gareth, and it says, Gareth, isn't one of the problems is that we are developing multiple public spheres that produce very polarized worldviews curated in part by social media? You're muted.
Yes, I mean, that's what it's trying to compress the whole potential discussions on the public sphere into one presentation is but I would certainly agree with that, and that's something that we can definitely explore from a linguistic perspective in terms of what is happening linguistically in terms of polarization and possibly how to counter that, but that's a whole another kettle of fish. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Alex Kinzer asked Walt, Dr. Wolfram mentioned that Republicans seem to be better than Democrats at using their language. Why do you think that is the case?
I'm not quite sure.
They have no shame.
What?
They have no shame.
Well, that's one of the things. But think of Trump's slogan. Can you think of Hillary Clinton's slogans today? If you think back, the Republicans, of course, George Lakoff thinks it's because the Democrats have not hired George Lakoff to give them their slogans. That may not be true, but for some reason, the Republicans have a history of coming up with very sort of mnemonic slogans that people recall, and they're doing it again even now. So my feeling is people who work on slogans need to sort of need more testing, but actually the Democrats have been way behind in the slogan fight.
I have a question from Dominica Baran. She says, I would like to ask Professor Newcity about the last comment he made. Why does he think the conspiracy charge against Trump would be more likely to succeed in court than an indictment charge?
I think incitement is very difficult because the First Amendment offers such extensive protection for speech, and incitement as a jurisprudential concept consists only of speech. I think it would be easier for a prosecutor to make a case for conspiracy, which is speech, obviously, but also, action in furtherance of the conspiracy. I think that is much more likely to be successful, because the sort of speech that goes on in a conspiracy is not going to be given the deference that a political speech is likely to.
I have a follow-up question, sort of. I saw on Twitter, so this is hearsay of hearsay, that people in the White House had said that he was excited of the storming of the Capitol and was wondering why everyone else was upset. If there is proven evidence of that, would that go towards a word I can't think of, his intent? There we go. I was like, it's an I word. Would that prove his intent in his speech if there is proven evidence of him being happy that people stormed the Capitol?
I mean, it certainly could be, yeah. But I think, well, yes, it could be offered. Proving intent in these circumstances, as much as anything else, is going to be an objective standard as to what is the meaning of the words that he used.
Are there any other questions? Feel free to send them in.
I'd like to add a comment. So first of all, and I want to say, Walt, Dwight Bollinger is one of my favorite humans, and everything he says is incredible. And I'm so glad to see him in presentations, not just mine. I think that the lack of closure that we've had because of these events, where so many important moments did not occur, whether they were verbal concession speeches or coming to closure, I think is very dangerous. That there was no final cadence to bring things full circle, and I think that it shows the power of speech acts when they do occur and when they don't occur. And I worry that this leaves a gaping wound, and it also has propagated a reproduction of denial, where there's smoke and mirrors about the validity of an election, of a presidential election, which will have far-reaching damaging effects for not just the American democracy, but for democracies across the world. And I think a lot of that would have been circumvented if there had been, following the sort of expectations of the speech acts we live our lives by. And that one of those things would have been a concession.
We have one more question, and then Dr. Mendoza-Denton will be saying something to us. But for Dr. Price, what do you think of the role of tech companies thinking of Twitter and Jack Dorsey's recent actions specifically should have in moderating and shaping the public sphere? That's from Kaylee Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really big implication. I think it's the question of, should they have banned Trump looms large in that particular question, and I'm not sure I have an answer for it at all in terms of the ought. I think that the way that Twitter and Facebook are guardians of the public sphere, or guardians of multiple public spheres, as that question has been put by before, mean that they're not beyond scrutiny and they're not beyond regulation. And I'm not in any way arguing that they should be. But I think there's a distinction between, and what I'm trying to point out here is a distinction between completely undermining the public sphere and media freedom or a notion of the free media by an elected official versus regulating large tech companies as guardians of the public sphere. I don't think those two things are in tension, and it remains to be seen what happens with them.
Dr. Mendoza-Denton, if you want to say something quickly about the appeal of emotion.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for an incredible, stimulating talk. I just want to ask you about the appeal to emotion that Donald Trump sometimes has when he talks about, you should be angry, he's fallen in love, some things make him sad. So this is a sort of direction that I think I'm really interested in, that he, in his populist appeal, some of it goes through appealing to emotion.
Good point.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, even when you look at words that are, it doesn't have to be love or
Right.
sad, rigged and stolen. These are very emotional words. So everything is, as Walt talked about, the hyperbolic nature of the discourse in general, but there are very few, there's no neutral language. So, I think that that's exactly right. And that would be an entire semantic field to have a heyday in. I think
Yeah. Yeah, so sometimes he'll talk about, I'm going to be angry at him, or we won't be so happy with him. That's how he threatened Pence, right? We're not going to be so happy with him if he doesn't do the right thing.
One more quick point from Dr. Baker is, without a concession speech, in theory, we can see Trump as the president in exile.
I have to comment that some of the discourse strategies that we've seen over the last 4 years are Stalinistic. It's actually frightening. Enemy of the people. Where is this coming from? These are not the kinds of things you expect to hear. And the idea, Lee mentioning the president in exile, this is really interesting. I think that you're absolutely right. It's exactly why. And then you can have, but we also know that it's a very dangerous game to play. I keep wondering where his outpost will be in exile.
No, but I've heard that saying now, because he did not concede, he still sees himself as a beleaguered president, and like he's just an exile or what, down in Florida. But I was struck by what you said, Edna. These speech acts that we live our lives, they're important, and because not whole nations, half of nations actually are still emotionally involved and committed to him. And so not having that explicitly symbolically stated, I think we've never seen it, but it's dangerous.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I'll unmute myself. That was all the questions we have. Does one of our presenters have anything else to say? Or, well, thank you all for coming. That, as mentioned at the beginning, this was our first Mellon Sawyer event of the semester. We will let you all know.
Hold on, Ab. We can't leave it at that. I think what we can do, there were some wonderful speech acts during the inauguration and some good plays to the emotion. And I really do think hopefully we've turned a corner, and it is nice to be able to see some of the symbolism, some of the voice, some of the just the logic, and some of the ways people are communicating in stark difference. Like with one, within a couple of weeks, we've seen it flip-flop back and forth. So I want us at least to end on a more positive note than that rather depressing last one. So thank you for that.
Actually, yeah, well, he is what he's been presented to be. But one of the, it is kind of interesting because a couple of days after the inauguration, there were these memes of Bernie Sanders all over Facebook. They were utterly hilarious. Everybody enjoyed them. And there was a positivity that had been absent for 4 years on Facebook. Now, of course, most of us select our friends, so they're more like us on Facebook. But I don't know about you. I woke up and I was reading and I was laughing out loud and I said, this is wonderful to be positive on Facebook. And I hope we get more of that, when I watch Rachel Maddow now in the evening and so forth, there's a lightness that there is a change in our disposition following this election. And I think that's something we want to celebrate. We want to keep going, and let's be positive and test negative.
On that happier note, also, if you hadn't seen, the young woman who presented poetry at the inauguration is going to present poetry at the Super Bowl, which is an interesting second act, but that shows how the direction we are moving.
I love living when I get up in the morning now.
But yes, so thank you all for coming, and we will let you know about our upcoming events.
Thanks.
Thank you. It's wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Paul, Gareth, Michael, fabulous. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.